talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. We're on video this week.
Well, maybe you're seeing us on video. This is definitely a special episode that we're recording as part of Ping Identity's Identify 2020 virtual conference. So for those that are watching this, we're actually going to record this podcast that we normally do weekly live, and this will be something hopefully you're watching as part of that. And if you're listening to it as part of our weekly feed, hello to you as well. So welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. It probably makes sense to really kind of maybe introduce Jim and myself to the audience that may be listening that might be new. We've been in the IAM space for a combined 32 years, right? Somewhere in that area.
That makes us sound a lot longer. Yeah, about 15, 16 years each.
And, we work for a company that provides advisory services, Identropy. This podcast is a separate entity that Jim and I do completely outside of the realm of that, and they're gracious enough to help out with that and let us do that. Why don't you tell a little bit about what this podcast is for and who it's for, Jim?
Right. So our podcast is designed for the IAM practitioner. We look for the podcast to be kind of an educational forum. We bring a lot of thought leaders from the IAM space with us and, explore a specific topic or their area of interest. Some weeks it's just Jeff and I kind of exploring a topic where we feel like, we have enough expertise or experience to kind of dialogue on. The podcast usually goes from a half hour to an hour long. And we start with every guest to understand how they got into IAM and whether IAM chose them or whether they chose IAM. Usually IAM chooses people. So just a little bit of background on me. I started my career in the very technical network engineering space. I was with a manufacturing firm and ultimately went from engineering to project management to identity and access management. Moved into the financial services space, and about 9 years ago, joined the dark side of consulting. I'm the principal consultant, which really is like a strategy development role within Identropy, and I work every day with Jeff Stedman.
You sure do. So similar background to Jim. Been in the IAM space again, 16, 17 years. My background is more on the operations and the business side of things. So working for a few large organizations that you probably would have heard about, especially if you connect with us on LinkedIn, which we are always open to LinkedIn connections from folks who are listening and want to get in touch with us. But that's where my background pretty much comes in. And then as part of the advisory practice, working alongside of Jim, helping organizations develop those strategies. More about the podcast itself. We've been doing this for a little over a year now. We're at 60 episodes and counting that we've put out basically every week since then. A lot of great guests that we've had in the past. We've got a global audience. So for the folks who are listening all around the world or watching this, here's our ugly faces for folks who are seeing that. And this is definitely a podcast where it's for practitioners and it's by practitioners, right? So trying to understand the day-to-day life of anyone who's in the IAM space and trying to come up with topics and interesting discussions to tackle real-world problems that we see out there. We try to make it as vendor neutral and agnostic as possible. So we're not here to try and sell anything. It's really more about getting to the heart of matters and trying to understand problems and hearing from, ourselves as well as our guests who come on to talk about how they've addressed or tackled, issues that they've seen, or talk about what are things to keep an eye on, coming up in the future. So we're always happy to take suggestions from our listeners. You can feel free to get a hold of us. We're at identityatthecenter.com. You can find more information about the show there. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And I think with enough of that intro, why don't we dive right into today's topic, which is all about establishing an effective IAM program. Before we get into that, Jim, is there anything that you want to bring up?
Yeah, so we want the podcast to be educational and entertaining, as entertaining as identity and access management can be. And so we throw some shtick in there every once in a while just to keep things interesting. And sometimes our guests are super entertaining. But so my shtick right now is not only is it establishing an effective IAM program, but it's a stepwise approach this is something that the word stepwise, I really wanted that to be in the title. So essentially, this is like a 4-step methodology to establishing an effective IAM program. Let's kind of just quickly go over the steps. So it's ownership, services, resources, and marketing. And we'll start with ownership. So, kind of the way we thought about this is step one, ownership. Who owns IAM? So when we go in and we're working with our clients, normally what we do is we set up an on-site workshop. Well, prior to COVID, it was an on-site workshop. So we're doing everything virtually now. But really, the first question really comes down to who owns IAM. And one of the perspectives that Jeff and I have always shared is that somebody needs to take IAM, put it on their back, and carry it, right? And as much as IAM has got to be a team effort, right? We got to pull everybody in. Somebody has to, ultimately say, I'm going to turn this into a program. I'm going to build the support within the organization. That's our perspective. And we call that role the IAM program manager.
Mm-hmm. And the IAM program manager is a really important part of any IAM program. And really, as we're starting to stand things up from an IAM program, we need that champion, right? Someone who understands the vision and the direction of where the IAM program needs to go and should be going. Doesn't necessarily have to be a very technical person, but needs to at least understand the strategy and the components and different things that are going to play together to help make that a success. That's going to be part of the organizational structure, is having that program manager. You may have something also like a steering committee. This is going to be some other, body of people who will help make decisions, break log jams, those sorts of things. Typically, it's more of a senior leadership type role, or at least people with enough juice, right, to make things happen, whether it's make a decision, assign resources, unblock resources, those sorts of things. So those are very important components as well as part of the program. And then also about the business, right? Where do they fit into this? Because it's their data. And you want to make sure that the business is part of the ownership equation when it comes to an IAM program. Their data, they are going to be responsible, hopefully, for understanding what their data is, how it's being secured, and then making the decisions as to who should have access to that data. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about what IT's role would be along with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ultimately, IAM is around ensuring that the right people have the right access. And so our perspective is that the business really needs to be the people deciding who has access to what. But they can't effectively do that without the right tools, without structured processes. So it's IT's role to essentially enable the business to make those access decisions, who gets access to what. But again, it has to be, not only do they have to have the tools have to work well, they have to be intuitive. They have to be something that enable the business so that you can put the business in the driver's seat, not only put them in the driver's seat, but really place the accountability on the business for managing that access.
Yeah, and part of that too probably introduces politics into the equation. Sometimes there can be a little bit of a Game of Thrones taking place within an organization when it comes to the dynamics around, the political aspect of a program, changing behaviors, who's going to be responsible for what. Maybe there's kingdom building, things like that. There can also be influencers, right? People who can influence the direction of an IAM program, whether it's part of the program or even externally. So being able to understand those dynamics and be able to, play the game sometimes of that within an organization is really important. And that can also, be something that can be very tricky to navigate, especially if you're new to the organization and you maybe not have built up the relationships yet. And that's why it's so important for IAM to have a leader, right? Who's going to be responsible for this? Who's going to carry the banner forward? Who's going to be able to, talk about and articulate the different things that are going to be important for the program to achieve, but also, be an influencer themselves, right? Get people on their side, help them understand the value that the program is bringing to the organization, and then, let the gospel of IAM, right, reach the audience that you're looking for, from an organization perspective. And sometimes, that can get into the areas of things like policies, standards, guidelines, procedures, et cetera, and even exceptions. Where do you think those types of things belong, Jim, from an IM program perspective?
Right. And just on the previous point around the politics and influencers, I don't think there's a magic bullet, right? There's not like one answer for every is going to work for all organizations globally. But one thing I will say is that the kind of the nirvana or the what everybody is striving for is this term of buy-in. They want to get buy-in to their strategy. And my perspective has always been the best way to get buy-in is to make sure that people feel heard, that they have a seat at the table, they have an opportunity to say, to contribute to, this is what I see as the problem, this is what I see as the solution. And as long as you can go back to those folks and make sure that they understand that, yes, I had my opportunity to state my case, I was heard, and it was recognized within the strategy. That's the closest you can get to ensuring that you're going to have buy-in. Now, when it comes to policies and procedures, I think IAM is typically what we see is like their access management policies within the information security policies and standards. And so that's the right place for it to exist. One of the perspectives that I've always had is that ultimately becomes the law, right? We don't have law enforcement going around and just enforcing whatever law they have in mind, right? They have to enforce the laws that are on the books. And so that's what the policies and standards are. And essentially that gives you then the ability to go around the business to say, you need to be in compliance with the laws on the book or the policies and standards. So it's very important that you're not arbitrarily enforcing rules and like, hey, this week we want to require everybody to do MFA. Those should be policies and standards, and then you should hold the business accountable, or the applications of the technology platforms, however you want to say it, accountable to stay in compliance with those policies.
What about things like exceptions? What's a good way for an organization to approach the exception process? Because there's going to be times where, some app, some service, whatever it may be, can't comply with either a standard or a guideline or whatever it may be, policy. How do you see organizations approaching that?
Right. Well, I think those are, again, exceptions to the policy. I think that policy exceptions need to be time bound, right? They need to expire after a certain point, and they need to align with one of the reasons for granting an exception. So usually a technology limitation. So if you have, for example, the most common example I see is that you have a legacy mainframe application. You have a standard that all applications need to use Active Directory as the source of authentication. Well, mainframe can't comply with that, right? Or it's really bending over backwards to make it comply. It makes more sense for the organization to issue an exemption. Maybe the exemption is 1 year long, maybe it's 2 years long, but the 2 years in this space is a half of an eternity. So the organization should be reviewing those exceptions. All this process should be formal. So I think that's part of it. Is what we're driving here is that this is about formality, right? It's not that we can cut a deal off to the side on who needs to comply with the policies and who doesn't. We want to do everything with transparency, and we want it to be formal.
Anything else we should bring up around ownership, or should we move on to step number 2?
Let's move on to step 2.
Okay, so let's talk services. This is where you really decide what is the strategy going to be for the organization, right? What is IAM going to provide? What's in, what's out? Are you going to do things like automated provisioning? Is it going to be manual provisioning? What are you going to do for passwords? Are you going to allow people to reset their own passwords? Do you have a single sign-on strategy? Do you have an MFA strategy? And I surely hope you do at this point, because MFA is table stakes at this point for organizations. But this is really where you're defining what are the services that the organization from an IAM perspective is going to offer out. And this can be an ever-changing list, right? You're probably going to start small. Here are a couple of different things that we're going to tackle this quarter, this year, whatever it might make sense. And then slowly, hopefully expand those services out to cover the breadth of all the things that IAM needs to keep up with. Are there any thoughts that you should think about, from like a scoping perspective, Jim, when it comes to internal, external, or maybe even, both when it comes to IAM programs?
Yeah. And so I'm thinking of, I'm a big fan of analogies. And so I want to use the analogy of, so this is the IAM service catalog. This would be analogous to, if you're having a help desk within your organization, more than likely you're not going to support every application. So if somebody goes and downloads some software off the internet and they install it on their laptop and they're using it to manage their personal finances and they call your corporate help desk, you're not going to support it, right? It's out of scope. And this is kind of similar, right? You support some limited set of corporate approved applications. So the service catalog in IAM is going to be things like we have authentication, Active Directory, maybe some authorization stuff, user lifecycle management, access reviews, things like that. Now, a couple of things to think about here is that you're not going to have it all on day one, right? So if you're a new program, your service catalog is going to be limited in the beginning. Over time, you're going to add more services, and they don't all need to be full-blown shared services where you do everything. You could provide consulting help to application teams. So for example, you might want to support application security, support the coders to secure their applications properly so they're not hard coding credentials in their code, things like that. At the same time, you don't want to write the code for them. So you've got some balance, not a full-blown shared service where you're doing the coding. At the same time, you're doing something. And where I really find this is important is to really think through this, because as you do your roadshow that we talked about earlier, you're going to get questions from technology teams. Is your strategy to do this? Are you taking over this? Are you and areas when it comes to things like authentication is a little more cut and dry. When you get into authorization, you have policy decision points, policy enforcement points. You've got how applications interpret that data. Are you going to be what amount of that are you going to be taking over with your IAM platform? And I think that's just very clear to be able to articulate what your strategy is.
Yeah, being able to make that decision is also something that sometimes can rise up to a steering committee, right? Who's going to be responsible for what? Who's going to deliver it? How is it going to be delivered? It's also important, right? You talked about the kind of the shared service versus a center of excellence type model where you're consulting out. If you're a smaller organization, this can also be an area where you just don't have the resources from a people perspective to go out and build out right this giant IAM organization. You may not need it. It may make more sense to have more of a consultant type role within your organization where the IAM program is consulting with different areas of the business or application developers or whatever it may be to help them understand best practices from an IAM perspective. What are the capabilities that already exist? Right? Don't go off and build yet another ID and password store for the application when you already have a perfectly good set over here. Maybe that's something LDAP based or Active Directory or maybe even something else along those lines. Don't reinvent the wheel, right? Help partner with the organization to build the services that they're looking for and let the IAM program handle things like authorization, right, or self-service, things like that. So it's important to understand, where those come from and where you want the delivery model to be. A bigger organization, they may have a central team that is responsible for all things IAM, right? I've been through situations where it was a small team and we decided, okay, we're going to go out and expand and take over the world, right? Anything that's SOX related, bring it into our scope, right? And it's a multi-year process usually, right, to do that kind of thing. But that's really only effective if you have the desire to build that central team. So you really have to understand what model makes the most sense for your organization when it comes to choosing whether you're going to be more of like a shared service center type model, or if you want to do something along the lines of that consulting tech role. Anything else around services or step 2 before we move on to step 3?
No, because I think step 3 is kind of something that I was going to transition into. So step 3 is around what kind of resources you have. One of the things I was thinking as you're talking about services was, especially with everything shifting out to Amazon and to Microsoft in the cloud and Google in the cloud, is that there's a major groundswell taking place around DevOps or DevSecOps, right? And a lot of this is happening so quickly, and developers are being able to deploy services that are important to the business in a way that with a velocity, if you will, that we haven't seen before. And what we don't want to do as the IAM team is get in the way. We don't want to be the what I call the progress prevention department, right? We don't want to say that's security, that's account management, we're taking that over. So this is the model I'm thinking about, is that why not let the developers run with that, but then provide a governance layer with the identity management team. In other words, make sure it's being done right? Make sure that the checks and balances are in place so that we don't have a runaway and we're not really compliant and we're just, kind of checking the box of security, but in reality, we're just doing what we want to do. Now, we need to make sure that it's being done right, but we don't have to do it ourselves. I think that's true of other areas. That gets into that same discussion we have with Center of Excellence versus shared service. In a shared services model, you really are doing just about everything. You're running the technology. With a Center of Excellence approach, you can start to think about, well, maybe our single sign-on platform is run by the Active Directory team. Maybe they're doing the build and run operations. We're part of plan. We're doing the vendor management piece of it. So I think, it kind of comes down to a RACI model. When you think about everything that it takes to run a technology or shared service, the IAM team doesn't have to have the resources to do every one of those items. It can be other areas of IT or even other areas of the business. For example, you don't want to be taking first level help desk calls for access management. Those should go to the help desk, right? That might be outside of IT even.
Yeah, and I think when you're thinking about building out these teams, right, consider the plan, build, run model, something on those lines where, who's going to fill in different roles. From a resourcing perspective, there's really three components. There's people, there's funding, obviously you need money to do things, right? And then there's the technology that's involved, kind of the three big buckets around that. So when it comes to people, you've got internal people, right? Are they existing people who are doing that work today? Or maybe they're new folks who are joining the team to either consolidate or take over that work. You've got external people, you've got partners, vendors, contractors, consultants, however you want to call them, right? These are the people who are not normally part of the team. They may be some sort of staff augmentation or maybe a managed service type who is also helping run or assist with some component of an IAM program. When it comes time for funding, to understand what your funding levels are you working more with CapEx or are you working more with OpEx? Because that can drive a lot of decisions when it comes to how do you staff this type of thing, right? Is it a big boost up front? This is common with a lot of organizations where, hey, they've selected this technology, they're going to need help getting it implemented, and the idea is to teach the fish and let the organization kind of run with it. Whereas some organizations, they want something that's more turnkey, right? Here's the outcome that I'm expecting. You go figure out how to make that happen within our environment, right? So understanding what your funding model looks like will help drive some of that type of things. One thing that's really important as part of an IAM program is trying to establish a program budget, right? And then more importantly, keeping it, because there's a lot of times where organizations will spend a lot of good money up front, get the latest and greatest from a technology perspective, and then it dies on the vine because no one took care of it. You can have the best product in the world, and if you don't take care of it, you're going to hate it in 3 or 4 or 5 years, however long it takes for it to become into a state of disrepair. So you want to make sure that from a funding perspective, when it comes to resources, that your IAM program, has the requisite funding to make sure that you can keep the services not only alive, but kept alive and in the state where it needs to be. Another area that I kind of briefly mentioned was technology. Maybe Jim, maybe you can share some of your thoughts around, where does the tech component around resourcing come in?
Right. So, well, quickly to back up, one of the things that I was thinking as you're talking was just, the challenge, and this has been a challenge as long as I've been in the workplace, adding new headcount is like, it's frowned upon, right? One of the things, and I'm coming from a consulting background or coming to you as a consultant, right? But I think it's extremely important that you have internal resources, that you have the ability that if somebody leaves the organization, that you don't have a hole. At the same time, I think consulting resources play an extremely important role. They let you expand the team and contract the team based on the work that's available. Now, one of the pitfalls I see some of our clients fall into is that they fail to have kind of a bucket of money set aside for consulting work that they know they're going to need to do. And then so every feature really needs a return on investment and an analysis and a pitch to get $10,000, $25,000 allocated to do something that's already part of the approved strategy, right? And it's everything that the organization needs to do. Now, I think when you start adding all that overhead to it, doing an outsourced model really becomes a true nightmare. Now, I've also, there's a lot of different issues when it comes to this. It's very difficult for organizations to find expert level, architect level people to basically hire, right? So if you were to say, I want to hire an expert level ping resource or an expert level SailPoint resource, that can be very difficult to find and retain that person. So, there's one more aspect to think about. Now, as far as kind of where we were talking about with technology, what is the technology that's needed, right? It kind of comes back to what is the problem that you're solving. So it's kind of the core identity access management is around who has access to what. It's, usually the key technologies are identity governance, privilege access management, and access management, or single sign-on technologies. You get into there's a pretty broad vendor landscape. I think that if you don't know the landscape yourself, I think using consulting resources or analyst firms can be a really great avenue to gain better understanding. There's a lot of forums out there, including what's out there on LinkedIn. And I think tapping into the community, things like this podcast, can give you some visibility into what's out there. I think the delivery model in terms of that vendor, whether they're cloud-based as a service, I think we all should be shifting to the as a service thinking framework, right? That should be the model, whether it's an on-prem, something that we install on our own servers, probably at Amazon or, in the cloud or on our own servers. The mentality should be thinking of it as a service. That's all about where it's going to be run. But I also think we need to be thinking about like DevOps. How are we going to automate the deployment and the management if we go with an on-prem model? Now, if that starts to get outside of kind of the space that you want to be in, a cloud-based model makes a whole lot more sense, I think. Mm-hmm. So, and then there's, all that, add to that is training, right? Who's going to know how to run those tools within your organization? And that's an investment. That's something that sometimes gets overlooked, is you have to put people into training. Then as you deploy the software, even if you're using a third party, make sure that they are part of that implementation project so that they're getting the knowledge transfer so that they truly know the system themselves.
Yeah, training is something that's often overlooked as part of budgeting, right? Making sure that people are trained up on the tools they have. I'm going to give a shout out to someone I work for. He was a big proponent in making sure that training was a part of any type of funding ask whenever there was new technology being entered into the organization. So, that's something I took with me. It's important, right? You need to know how to use your tools, and you want to make sure you get the most value out of it. Should we move on to step 4?
Yeah, the only other thing I would say with technology, though, is like if you do have tools, you have current investments, you have to look at whether or not those are things that could be leveraged going forward, or if it's truly the time to make a replacement. There's a time to make a replacement, I think. Think not only what you need now, but think where you need to be a few years down the road, and go with some kind of vendor technology where the vendor is forward-looking and kind of investing in their platform.
I agree. So let's talk step 4 here, marketing. This is something that is near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time, as part of IAM programs, getting out and kissing babies and shaking hands and all the different things that go along with marketing an IAM program. It's something that a good program manager and other members of the IAM program itself, not just the program manager, needs to have the capability to be able to, talk about the things that are going on from an IM perspective. What are the services being delivered? Being able to build relationships throughout the organization, bringing people in to be part of the solution, helping them understand what the capabilities are, so they're not going off and getting their own thing in place, whether they go off and buy it or build it or whatever it may be. And then also being able to navigate the politics that we've talked about, right? Being able to say, okay, here's what we're trying to do. Here's the strategy, getting the influence out there to be able to make sure that people are moving forward with the way things should be going. If you're new to an organization or maybe new in this role, chances are maybe this has been tried in the past, right? So then the question becomes, yeah, what's different this time, right? We've tried that, it didn't work out, we'll just kind of sweep it under the rug and be done with it. So if you're trying to start up a new program, you want to make sure that you understand what have been the past failures and how you're going to address those, right? You don't want to repeat history. It's okay to get better. It's okay to get smarter as an organization, right? Day by day. Take those lessons learned and pull them up and make sure that if it's been something that's critical, a public failure, take it head on, right? Hey, we know we tried this in the past. It didn't work. And here's why we think that is. Here's how we're going to address that moving forward. So being able to pull that forward and make sure that, you meet it head on so that it doesn't become an issue down the road. And another big thing too that you have to be very careful about is managing the scope and the promises that come along with an IM program. You do not want to be in a position where you are over promising and under delivering. If you can, you want the opposite, right? Under promise and over deliver. That may not always be possible, but at least make sure that the organization understands when they're going to get a capability or a service, who is it for, and what they can expect from a usability experience as well. Don't go in and promise the world and then come up short. Make good promises and then deliver those on time. Another important part of that is a roadshow. I know Jim and you and I have worked on those in the past. What are some important parts of a roadshow, or maybe some of the things that you want to touch on from a marketing perspective?
Right. I mean, the roadshow is all about marketing the IM strategy. So now the assumption is you're at the point where you have a strategy, you know what you want to do, and you need to get the word out there. Ultimately, you may need to present this to the top levels of the organization. I mean, there are many times where we're working with organizations and we're presenting to like a COO, somebody who's like, the number two person in charge of the organization. I've actually presented to a board of directors of an organization before. So these are significant investments of dollars, right? And people who are running the organization need to understand what they're going to get for those dollars spent. I think it's important that when you go to present it, it's not the first time they've heard of it, right? Because then they're going to fall back on what they already know or try to link it to something they know. So this is the importance of the roadshow, right? Is, getting the opportunities with people who, we talked about politics, we talked about influencers. Who are the people who are influencers to that? Let's use the COO example. Influencers to the COO who can speak his or her language and make them understand within their context why this is an important investment. So this is why it's important to potentially work your way up the chain. It might start 3 levels down from the COO, but you get to the person who can influence the COO and make them understand why this is important. When you go to present to the COO, it's simple, right? You might be able to get through it with 2 or 3 slides because they already get it, right? And you may also be able to get some tips in terms of, what is the right language to be using to communicate your message.
Yeah, being able to understand what the services are, communicate those is super important. I know that we've kind of gone on and on here. Why don't we start to wrap things up a little bit? Maybe we can cover the 4 steps again. There was ownership, services is number 2. Third is resources, and then the 4th is marketing. With that all being said, there are certainly some other themes to keep in mind, right, as you're trying to stand up a program. It's a journey. Doesn't happen overnight. It can take time to figure out the lay of the land, understand where things are going, build those relationships, and really kind of gain the support to move forward. That is something that definitely is something to keep in mind. You want to make sure that as you stand up this program, that you don't just take a whole bunch of money and then disappear for 2 years, right? Have something that you can hang your hat on from a win to the organization. Doesn't matter if it's big or small or whatever it may be, but try to show value from a program perspective at least every quarter, right? Every 90 days, here's how we're better now than we were 3 months ago, or maybe 4 months ago, something along those lines. You want to be able to show that consistent string of wins and victories as you get smarter, better over time, et cetera. Keep the business involved. It's their data, right? IAM job is to arm them with the tools for them to be able to make good, informed decisions, to help guide them along the path of information security and best practices, and why maybe they should listen to you from a security perspective to make sure that their data stays secure as much as possible. And then change, right? It's hard. You got to keep fighting the good fight. Change is very difficult with an organization. And I know, Jim, you and I have both been part of those, situations where, man, it feels like you're just, butting up against a steel wall, and it's a matter of finding the right switch or the right key to kind of unlock that door and move forward, and being able to understand the language of the organization, what resonates with the people you're talking to. We had a guest on recently who kind of talked about one of their talks where, the COO maybe doesn't care how many password resets you did. It's not important, right? They have a service that does that, right? Figure out what is important to those types of people and tailor the message around that. Are there any other themes that you want to bring up before we start to close things out here?
Well, I think a lot of the folks who are interested in this podcast are practitioners and maybe program managers. I think that as a program manager, you've got to practice talking about identity and access management in business terms, in terms of risk, in terms of return on investment, in terms of outcomes. We've talked a lot about that, but those are, as a professional, as somebody who can be a leader within the organization, those are things that I think we can all get better at, right? And by, going through your roadshow, meeting with the business, tapping into resources within this IAM community, listening to this podcast, right? And I'm not trying to pump the podcast, but we have a lot of thought leaders who, they talk about identity and access management in those terms, and then you start thinking those terms yourself. That's what you need to be able to do. You need to be able to talk about identity and access management as a business objective, as a business outcome. It's not just technology. And really selling a program within an organization, it takes both, but to sell it probably takes more of the business side of things.
So I think we had a pretty good show here today. Hopefully people enjoyed it. It was something maybe a little bit different from a conference perspective to see, Jim and I put together an episode and how we do it, at least our version of a podcast, which we have no experience doing. We're a year into it. Still don't know what the heck we're doing sometimes. As far as this topic goes, there's ownership, again, services, resources, and then marketing, the effective ways, and as Jim will put it, the stepwise approach to building an effective program. Any parting thoughts, Jim, before we let these fine folks go?
No, thanks for everyone's time.
Okay. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You can find us in all the major podcast app stores. You can find us at identitycenter.com. Jim and I are on LinkedIn. We have links to to our profiles on identitycenter.com. We're always happy to connect with people. We love it when people email in, ideas for show topics or things like that. So, please don't hesitate to do that. We try to get to all those as much as we can. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. And thank everybody for watching or listening, depending on where you're at. So thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.